Welcome to our February salon. We've been reading Minds Wide Shut by Morrison and Shapiro this month. I've had conversations offline with lots of you, and many of you have had some conversation online, and we're delighted to have you join us here in our salon today. We'll try to run things in much the same way that we did in our January salon and allow Pete to sort of kick things off as the star of the show. And then we'd like all of you to be able to get in with your questions, your comments, your thoughts on the book, on questions people have raised and so forth. So we'll probably take a couple of questions at a time and just sort of see where it goes. We've got about 90 minutes together and I'm looking forward to the conversation. So Shelley, they're all yours and I'll keep working on my video.
Well, thank you everybody for joining us. I'm actually just going to turn it right over to Pete.
Okay, great. Thank you, Shelley. Thank you, Amy. I'm going to try to address one of the questions Amy asked us all in the chat because she directed it at me. Well, she directed two questions at me, but one of them was, why did I think this book was worth our time reading? And I'm going to try to summarize it by 4 points. The first one is actually that I paired it with Buchanan for a reason. And the reason is to sort of get on the table what living a radically democratic life and attitude actually entails. Sorry about that. Hold on a second. Okay, good. All right. Right, I'm gonna get this. Sorry. One thing I haven't learned in the Zoom age is to keep the damn house phone near me in case it goes off, so I don't have to actually get up and do that. All right, so the question is why the Minds Wide Shut? Why following on the heels of reading Jim Buchanan, which is a very technical economist, and the reason is about the nature of what it requires to have a democratic society and what are the commitments that we have to have. And one of the arguments is that for democracy to be working, we need to have cyclical majorities. Turn taking has to be built into the system. And we have to respect the idea of the turn taking built into the system. What we can't have is permanent winning coalitions. If you have a permanent winning coalition, then that undermines the idea of democracy because those who lose out in the political game will always feel that they don't have a voice or aren't part of the conversation. And so what does it mean to live a democratic life? Does it mean one man, one vote, or one person, one vote? What it means is the ways in which you interact and relate to one another. And what are the commitments that you have to do that? And one of them is whenever you believe in truth judgments in politics, that's the route towards tyranny, right? If you believe you have a red line to God, then it's very hard for you to then accept turn taking, right? So this is how does Buchanan negotiate that, right? What you read in the first part was the relatively absolute and the rejection of that kind of idea. So that's the first thing. I thought that these two paired well together in emphasizing that point because like in my conversation with Mike Munger, the relatively absolute is one of the trickier and slipperier concepts in Buchanan. So I wanted to sort of highlight that idea. The second point that I wanted to make was that I'm embroiled a lot as a social scientist in these debates about rationality. And I think that one of the problems is a misunderstanding of what economists are arguing when they argue that people engage in rational choices. And I think literature a lot of times highlights the agony of choices that we make, and in particular, Russian literature. So Gary Saul Morrison is an expert in Russian literature, and the characters and the highlights that he brings out from, people like Dostoevsky or Tolstoy or, even Chekhov or whatever, they confront seriously this notion of the agony of choice. As anyone who's listen to Israel Kirzner give one of his more eloquent lectures, he'll talk about this issue of the agony of choice. Humans are not robots. Humans are not rats. So they're neither robotic or are they just animal reactions. Humans are these creative creatures that strive to do the best that they can given their situation, but they're caught constantly between alluring hopes and haunting fears. And so what does it mean to actually be a rational actor in this discourse? And in the book, there's also a lot of discussion about the nature of the fullness of understanding the human condition that comes out of the humanities. And so it's this intersection of the humanities and the sciences that I think actually this reintegration that I thought was kind of intriguing in the book. Third position. So the first position deals with politics and the nature of a society that's been torn apart, which is like, I think, a more increasing divisive society. And how do you solve it in the way Buchanan thinks about it and the way that they think about it. The second one is the nature of the social sciences when we take into account a more realistic notion of what the human actor faces in the world, and put that at the center of our analysis. The third one is their discussion of economic fundamentalism reflects, I think, a massive misunderstanding in the world, which is very frustrating to me, given that one of the authors is an economist. So the idea that there are, that the dominant approach in economics is one in which we believe in laissez-faire, and laissez-faire without any, in a very rigorous and rigid way, is insane to me. Anyone who's taken any economics knows that you learn supply and demand, and then after you learn supply and demand, you learn all about market imperfections. And you teach your undergraduates from Econ 101 all the way through to graduate school about how you can have market imperfections and government as a corrective. Rarely do you actually talk about the issue of the problems of government as a corrective, let alone the entrepreneurial solution to market failures. All right. And so just like the rationality idea, the mechanistic model of the market is actually a mistake. The real market is driven by what? Creative and clever actors that populate the economy, that recognize that today's inefficiency is tomorrow's profit opportunity. All right. That there's constant feedback loops in markets. And there's constant, and the problem with politics is that there's not as much feedback mechanisms. So again, as pointed out by some of the answers to Amy's question, which I think was very relevant, is that they can't really identify a market fundamentalist, right? I was waiting for them to say Ludwig von Mises, because that's everyone's like, scary boy or whatever, right? They just haven't read the first 100 pages of Human Action, actually. Amy had to talk me off the ledge of making you all read Human Action as one of the monthly readings here, because that, to me, by the way, it's the greatest book ever written in economics. Stop. End of story. Not Adam Smith, not John Stuart Mill. Ludwig von Mises wrote the greatest book in the history of economics, but it's misread by everyone, foes and friends. So that would make a really great group. We'll have to come back to that again some other time. But what does it mean to be a market fundamentalist? And what is it in this conversation about markets that we can learn from about the debates with socialism? Because one of the things that's ironic about this book is that the authors know that socialism only brings us the four, horses of the apocalypse, right? Socialism can't promise us any of these great deliveries. So what does it mean then for them when you say you're a market fundamentalist? And then the final thing is that for those of us here who are professors, how about our lived university life? I particularly think, and maybe I'm just getting old and cranky, so you can dismiss it, but when I was a youngster and starting out my career, which was in the 80s, and especially when I was a student, late 70s, early 80s, one of the first times I ever heard of the ACLU was they were defending the right of the Nazis to march in Skokie, Illinois, or whatever. All right. Which had at that time, I think, the largest population of Holocaust survivors in the United States. Okay. And you understood the Nazis weren't good people. It's not like you said, yay, you know, we're like the Nazis or whatever, but you had this understanding of the robustness of an open and free society conversation and the ability to defeat arguments. And what is going on, Sarah and I talked a little bit about this. So I wonder whether or not in universities we're getting more and more stultifying conversation, name-calling conversation, more fundamentalist in the university, meaning that they point fingers at the opponent's side rather than try to understand the opponent's side. And to be completely honest with you, I pay very little attention to my university life other than my own writing and my own teaching and whatnot until, basically the last, I don't know, 5 to 8 years or something like that. So roughly around 2016. So maybe something having to do with Trump tied into all this stuff. But there was it was even a little bit before that. It was tied into, people pointing fingers about other people in universities about whether or not they're climate science deniers, whether or not they're, receiving dark money, these kind of issues, and therefore trying to delegitimize various alternative voices on the campus. And I think that the book does a good job of talking about that discourse, mainly in our politics, but how has spilled over into intellectual life more in general. And I think that that's something we should debate and discuss and talk about. And I wanted to get all of, your views on these issues as well. Because, sometimes we can be myopic about things and see only our little world, and then we mistake, what's going on, or we can fail to recognize, what is around us because, as the anthropologists say, a fish sometimes doesn't recognize the water that they swim in. And so, what are we doing here with all of this? Anyway, those were my, motivations for wanting to read this book. I think Amy's questions are great. And I want to turn it open to the queue to just do it. So the normal way to do this would be just use your raise hand function and we can go from there. Yeah, Michael, go ahead.
Well, just one thing I found interesting in the book was, they talk about one of the marks of a fundamentalist being someone who believes that the truth is self-evident. So just one example that came to my mind, this I find interesting is, so there's a concept in Jewish law where if someone the Talmud discusses a Jewish child who's abducted as an infant by Gentiles and so is never raised in the Jewish religion, are they still held liable to keep Jewish law? And so they're called Tinok Shenishba, which literally just means like child taken captive. And the conclusion is no, they're not liable because how could they have possibly known better? So this is sometimes used nowadays by Orthodox Jews to discuss how should the approach be to non-Orthodox Jews. And the idea is basically, well, they weren't raised Orthodox, so they can't know that we're right and they're wrong. So,
yeah.
So there was one Orthodox rabbi, though I forget who it was, who basically said, well, yeah, that is true of a Jew who has never met an Orthodox Jew. But he said, but look, everyone's met Orthodox Jews. The moment you meet one in the checkout counter at the grocery store, well, now you've met an Orthodox Jew, and it'll just be immediately obvious to you from the briefest conversation that Orthodox Judaism is correct. So like any non-Orthodox Jew who's met an Orthodox Jew for even the briefest moment of time in the checkout counter at the grocery store, he says, at that point, they are now liable because it'll be perfectly obvious to them that they're wrong and we're right. And I, of course, I read that and I was flabbergasted. I just showed this to other Orthodox Jews, and they were like, "What's the problem? This is true. This is an accurate argument, of course." I'm like, "Are you serious?" Like, yeah. And then other Orthodox Jews were like, "No, Michael, I see your point. You're absolutely right. You can't say this guy, But we started a whole debate.
So, I mean, there's always a kind of a thin line, right, between religious commitments and a meta rule of toleration among different religions, right? So, I think this is true. Like, so in the philosophy of science, one of my favorite scientists is Michael Polanyi. And Polanyi is a title of his major contribution to philosophy of science is a book called Personal Knowledge. And I think it's important to understand who Polanyi was, because even in this book, they repeat the myth of Einstein and the Michelson-Morley experiments, which actually isn't what happened. That's how Popper communicates it, but that's not what really went on in the story. Einstein didn't need the Michelson-Morley experiments to prove him wrong. It helped establish him among other people, but not Einstein himself. Einstein knew it was right. When he went to Princeton, they had no labs. And people said, Professor, Einstein, how can you go to Princeton? They have no labs. And he pointed to the pencil in his pocket. And he said, that's the only lab I've ever needed. Right? It's the only lab I ever needed. Because there's a difference between the way you do these things. So I wonder about the issue of the individual commitments. Let's say if I'm an Orthodox Jew and I believe strongly in the power of that tradition, right? But at the same time, if I live in a society that in fact is, I'm part of a more cosmopolitan society. So one of the things that always amazed me about Israel Kirzner was that he lived in these two worlds at once all the time. He lived in Brooklyn in an extremely Orthodox community, had no TV or anything like that. But then, he'd get on a subway train and come in and teach at NYU, the most cosmopolitan, university in the world, right? Largest private university in New York City. And how did you do that? Like, I would have gone insane, I think, flipping back and forth between those two worlds, but he was quite comfortable in it. And I tend to think of it as a kind of an interesting dialogue. And what the problem comes is when, people are unable to live in these different worlds at once because their minds can't allow them to do it. And I think that's the biggest issue. Anyway, Alice.
Oh, hi, everybody. I was thinking about Amy's selection of page 282 as sort of what the summation of the book is, or what the authors might have intended the point of the book to be. And I was thinking about how that passage is sort of reflections on how we handle the world in terms of this fundamentalist circumstance, what we can do to reflect on our own decisions, to recognize the times we've been mistaken, to think about how we can be proven wrong, that there's room for honest disagreement. And then I was thinking about another passage about what I thought might also, or perhaps be even more pointedly, their point. And probably not cleverly, I turned to the very last page, the 288, 289, where they remind us again of the righteous indignation that abounds, people speaking over each other, screaming louder, the egoism of the unhappy. But the final little paragraph ends with sort of this hopeful circumstance. Let's not give up hope. And the point being, I think that they're making is that the better that we can understand this fundamentalist mindset, the more likely we can be helpful in this process. And through this book and what I know Sarah loved, so many amazing points and uses of literature, I definitely think that point came across to understand so many ways they brought this up, even with little parts like that. Price and Prejudice, which I want to come back to later. There's an author I'd never heard of before that maybe many of you have, that was brought up in chapter 3 on page 124, Hoffer, The True Believer. I feel like I should have known about this, something that in the side note, we talked about Hillary Clinton reading, but I found something that was pointed out on that next page, 126, about Hoffer, talking about how people flock to movements because it's so much more comforting to accept the truths of the social group to which one belongs than to live the skeptic's lonely life of doubt. And I paused and was thinking about that for a while, about how few people we know that can live long as sort of being the only person to think that way, and until you find others that do. And the paragraph finishes with, the world of opinion may bring us closer to genuine truth, but it runs against deep currents of our nature, since we intuitively prefer a finalized doctrine to an endless series of approximations. It goes on to the next page to talk about, given human nature, hatred is a stronger motivator than respect and decency, let alone love. It made me think of Adam Smith's point in Theory of Moral Sentiments that, boy, when we're angry and hurt by someone else, there's nothing we want more than our friends to join us in that feeling against that other person, even more so than liking the same things that we like. And I just thought that there was some very deep points in using so many different examples of what, not only what examples of what are fundamentalism, but the thinking behind it, and much of which I haven't thought about, of what gets people to think so differently from myself, I guess is how I'll finish that.
Yeah. So it's kind of a fascinating thing for people who are involved in like liberal ideas or freedom ideas, thinking about the attractiveness of Ayn Rand. So it's kind of an intriguing thing for me, because at the moment, like, for example, I like to say to people that our culture is desperately in need of an Ayn Rand type figure, but I don't know if we are desperately in need of an Ayn Rand type mentality. And so how do you get an Ayn Rand type figure without an Ayn Rand type mentality is a kind of intriguing question, I think, because one of the reasons why she was such a powerful force at the time that she wrote was because she picked up and challenged the existing zeitgeist with just extreme confidence. You know, there was no doubt in her mind that everyone else was wrong and she was going to be on the right side of things, right? And that's one of the reasons why it was so able to take it on, right, in a lot of ways. I mean, there's something intriguing about, even in science, like someone like Murray Rothbard was willing at a very young age to write attempt to write a treatise. Someone like Jim Buchanan never wrote a treatise, or Hayek never wrote a treatise in economic science where he laid it all out for you from soup to nuts. This is what you need to know about economics from A to Z. And, you know, if you know this, but actually at the time that Rothbard picked up pen to paper, again, the world was dominated by Keynesian and, market failure theory. And he had to have the confidence to be able to stand up and do that. And how can you square confidence with also limitations on the idea that, the truth claims that you can make in politics? Again, the confidence with the recognition of the Kantian point that out of the cricket timber of humanity, nothing straight is ever made. I don't know how people balance that. And so it was an interesting use in the book, the way they used the hedgehog and the fox, because in my reading of the hedgehog and the fox, it's always been about epistemology. And the hedgehog wasn't actually someone who was always pushed to the side. It was like, you need hedgehogs and you need foxes, right? I think that's the original Isaiah Berlin, notion of it. They kind of made it out that the hedgehogs are the ones who end up being the fundamentalists, and the foxes are the ones who discover constantly knowledge. I mean, maybe I'm reading too much into it, but, it's kind of like Hayek also used to try to say he was a fox. And when I read Hayek, I think of him as a hedgehog, right? He had a unifying theme that he saw throughout the whole thing. When I wrote my book on Hayek, I had him having a common theme from the time he was in his 20s until he's in his 80s, and I can pull that out. And so that's a hedgehog, not a fox. A fox is someone who's constantly coming up with, new evidence to make them ask new questions and things like that. And so I found that kind of interesting as well. So we want to cultivate the fox-like curiosity, but do we necessarily have to give up the idea of the enduring lessons? And how do you balance those two things? I think that's an interesting question throughout. But what the real problem is if we get too attracted to the hedgehog and then we never allow our curiosity, right? And I think that's what they're trying to suggest is the real problem. So I don't know. I'm fascinated by that. And you as an educator, I would love to hear your thoughts maybe when we come around again about the discourse that goes on in young minds. Which ideas do young minds latch onto? Because they want something to believe in some sense, right? So Craig Brown.
All right, so I thought it was interesting, but probably not a coincidence that Becker's Marketing Kidneys and minimum wages were two of the examples that the authors repeatedly pointed out as economic fundamentalism. And so I'm kind of curious, how do you maintain openness to empirical data or other viewpoints when we know, like as a matter of supply and demand theory, that price ceilings set above equilibrium causes shortages and unemployment? Said another way, I think they cited this book a couple times. As a leader in the Austrian school tradition, how do you personally maintain conviction without becoming a fanatic? How do you think about the balance between theory and data is really the question.
So so forget Austrian economics, just economics.
Yeah.
And it's, again, reveals in some sense my biases, right? So I'm an economist, and I believe as a result of being an economist, you recognize that we live in a world of scarcity. Scarcity implies that we must, make trade-offs. Those trade-offs require that we negotiate those trade-offs. In order to do that, we need tools to the human mind to help us negotiate those trade-offs. In a commercial society, they come to us in the form of property, right? Prices and profit and loss. To put it in a very more colloquial way, demand curves slope downward. There is no such thing as an upward sloping demand curve. Demand curve slope downward, okay? Supply curve slope upward, all right? Empirics is the magnitude that's represented in the slope of the line. That's it. But there's no way in hell, I don't believe in Giffen goods. I think it's actually a bullshit claim, because all you actually have is a shift in the demand curve. People are forgetting that there's a shift in the demand curve rather than the idea that there's actually a fixed demand curve. But that's too technical, Michael, so we'll talk about that again. And again, it's not because Slutsky and the various different income and substitution effects are like over swamping or whatever. No, just demand curve slope downward. And that might sound dogmatic to people, right? But what the issue is that the empirics is in the magnitude of the effect. So if the market rate of wages are $5 an hour and you raise the minimum wage to $5.25, the disemployment effect's not going to be all that great. And maybe some of the other effects you might say, like, okay, like maybe whatever. But if the minimum wage is if the market wage is $5 an hour and you try to have a minimum wage of $10 an hour, well, get ready, right, for disemployment effects. And it doesn't matter whether or not that's done in, Newark, New Jersey, or in San Francisco, California, or in, Hawaii, or in Japan or China, or come all the way around the world the other way in France or whatever. You're going to have these disemployment effects. The question is if the market rate is set above. So how do you actually justify this kind of idea? So there has to be a balancing between the theoretical structures that we work out in the logic of choice and the situational logic of the market and the empirical realities that affects the slope of the curves. So I think, as I might have mentioned here already, I think one of the best discussions of economics, again, maybe not, I think it as the implications, by the way, of Hayek's 1937 paper, which this is controversial. I think it's the greatest Misesian essay ever written, but people fight against that idea. But I think that the key issue about economics is the analogy would be the law of the tides and the operation of the tides under any particular harbor. So we can know in an exact way, right, the nature of the laws of gravity and the impact on the tides. But the way in which that is manifested in any particular harbor is going to be a function of the way in which the harbor is constructed. So if the harbor is constructed a certain way, that's going to then lead to the tides operating in that harbor differently than they would otherwise. And so that's the empirical part of economics, understanding the nature and structure of that harbor. And so with any of these kind of questions, economics has to have a very strong empirical component to it. But the theory, the exact theory, is a function of logic. And I think weighing those two things against each other is how we do economic science. And that's part of the reason why they're confused. Right? They're confused in that sense. But what's so weird is that they're so strong in the next chapter about economics. So the chapter on market fundamentalism is weak, but the chapter on basically price and prejudice is very strong. All right. It's not like, all of a sudden, anti-Doreen all of a sudden is like, it has an interesting point. No, it's screwed. It's screwed from day one. It's screwed from all the way to the end. Right. Marxism doesn't work. End of story. Put a period at the end of it. Right. It's a failed idea. It doesn't work. It doesn't work there. It doesn't work there. It's not going to work in Mars. Okay. It just doesn't work. All right. And so how do you square that with the idea of the earlier claim? And again, market, Becker's market for organs. Come on. Like, we live in a reality of shortage of organs. How are you going to actually match organs with in the right way? So the matching market through the market mechanism is going to end up by eliminating that, thing. Now, we might, due to our repugnance, fight against it, but, anyway. Sorry, I got too emotionally vested in that. Maybe I'm a market fundamentalist. I just deny, I'm spending too much time denying it. Anyway, Barry. Barry, you're still muted.
Sorry. Thanks, Pete. I was interested in following that up about the sort of the market fundamentalism, thinking about the political fundamentalism. And on page sort of 281, there's this lovely sort of line which seems to be about in the real world, but not in the thinking of fundamentalists. There are always trade-offs in politics as well as economics. We live in a world where there is no gain without loss, and where to choose one thing means foregoing something else. And it almost sort of, there's an element of sort of opportunity cost, but it also seems to be much more of a sort of zero-sum game sort of approach to things. And I read the final sort of chapter as we're getting all this sort of stuff about Putin and the sort of invasion in the backdrop against
Sorry, folks.
And my other sort of question, sort of point was, when you go back to sort of the chapter about sort of divided we stand, thinking purely about politics, there seems to be a sort of almost any views are acceptable, yet there are some views, some sort of stances which are actually against the sort of the rules of the game. That they sort of say, they talk about how sort of say the never Trumpers would vote for Sanders completely again to avoid Trump getting their support, to try to avoid him winning. It might be that in certain circumstances, some people's positions are detrimental to basically ending up with America sort of wandering into a sort of a sort of fascist state, and as a sort of warning. So I think there's some really interesting sort of literary parallels that you could sort of draw here, which I think the authors are perhaps sort of not really alive to.
Yeah, so I realized that we have a lot of hands up here, and I don't want to spend all the time trying to put on my own opinions, because I think your opinions are more valuable on this. But I think, all I would say to that, Barry, is I think one of the most striking like little stories that they tell is the New Hampshire Democrats being asked whether or not they'd rather have an asteroid that destroys the Earth or have Trump win re-election. And that it was something like I'm doing this off the memory of my head, but something like 62% of the Democrats said, I'd rather the Earth to end and destroy all human life than Trump. Okay, so to me, the problem in America today is that we put too much weight on politics, right? We care too much about politics. It's, again, I might be guilty of biased reading, but one of the things I think about when I read Tocqueville is that one of the great things about democracy in America is we didn't give a crap about the king and the queen. In Europe, when the court's running around, all they care about is the king and the queen. When I'm in Tocqueville's Democracy in America, what I care about is what's going on in my bridge club, down the street. That's what I care about. I don't care about what's going on in Washington or whatever. And maybe that's the ultimate privileged position, and you could criticize me or whatever. But the idea that I would willingly have the earth end rather than to have another Tweedledee or Tweedledum as president of the United States just seems insane to me. The fact that my sister, who I love dearly, is a very strong sort of Hillary person. The fact that I wouldn't love my sister, as deeply as I do because she cares about, Hillary Clinton and whether or not Hillary Clinton wins the presidency is not something that I can't imagine anyone doing it. But yet they report that when they first started teaching, religion was the divide of who you would marry, and now it's politics. Think about that. I'm not going to marry you because you're a Republican or you're a Democrat or something like that. These are young people that have come to this position, 18, 20 to 22-year-olds. It's insane to me that this is the world that we're in nowadays. And so to me, I think what's happened is we've put so much faith in the truth of politics when in fact what we should do, and I mentioned this in Sarah's conversation with me, when I taught my economics and the humanities course, I always used to tell the students the following thing. I'd say, there's facts and there's truth. Truth being about the human condition. And I said, what you have is novelists. Novelists are fantastic at telling us about the human condition. They capture truth. But what they don't do is necessarily be factual. All right. Journalists, they try to be factual, but they're never truth. There's no truth in journalism. There's only facts that we should get if journalism is done right. If we talk to politicians, we get neither truth nor facts. And we should just build that into the equation. That's what we're going to get. It's all manipulation and deceit and lies. It's all BS and lies. Scholars, if they're going to be any good, should be both factual and truthful. They should capture us about the human condition, yet ground it in facts. To give you an example, like Hannah Arendt or someone like that, right? So these are people that really capture the nature of the human condition, and it's grounded in actual factual statistics, factual life. So to me, that's what we're trying to look at in these debates. But what's happened is we now turn to politics for truth. And when we turn to politics for truth, our life goes to hell in a handbasket. And so we need to back off of the politics and truth as truth and as truth judgments. Now, maybe I'm wrong. I mean, and that's not just because I'm reading the book that I'm saying that. I actually think that's what a teacher is about. The most important questions is, I don't know. I need to keep learning. And, but this is my judgment at the moment, but maybe I'm wrong about that. But I think this is the issue, is that politics is not the same as science. And so fundamentalism in religion or in politics or in science has these huge different outcomes of the way that we think about different things, right? So, yeah. Anyway, I'm going to try to be quiet so that that's a non-credible commitment. But Philip, and then Scott, then Sabine, Amy, Craig, and Scott Brown.
Thank you. I just wanted to mention one item that is related to what you just said. And that is that I think it is particularly worrisome in these times that the views that people tend to hold are more and more linked and really integral, an integral element of their identity. So once your own views or beliefs you hold become really a vital part of your own identity, it's far more difficult really to challenge them. And any cognitive dissonance that you experience is really viewed as a threat to your own identity, and that actually has nothing to do with whether we are in the realm of politics or religion or whatever. And I think it goes even deeper than kind of the notion of fundamentalism. It's really this linkage of views to identity. And this seems to be a trend And I have to say I'm quite worried about that. There's one observation. And the second I just wanted to add was that I didn't like the book that much, but I very much like the discussion. So I guess I have to revisit my view on the book, because in the end it triggers this kind of discussion. And the authors put a lot of emphasis on kind of people that pursue their views quite aggressively, basically as fundamentalism towards each other, and they don't listen to each other. And intriguingly, at the same time, the examples that they quote from literature are all about, or most of them are about people that actually grapple with what and whom to believe, and actually whether to hold a belief at all. Speaking of Dostoevsky, for example, and also in others. So there was a bit of a kind of disconnect here. And the other thing is that if you look always at the discussion that takes place, that is between people that have very strong beliefs, I think one is tempted to overlook that there is what is called a silent majority. Whether it's a majority is an open question, but there are a lot of people that are silent, or that actually don't say what they mean and say things that they don't mean. And that reminds me of a wonderful book that I hold in high regard of economist Timur Kuran. It's called Private Truths and Public Lies, about preference falsification. And I think it was I think it's more than 20 years old, and you read it today, and it's just mind blowing to see that most of his viewpoints and thoughts about the future actually have come true, because there is a tendency now, against the backdrop of fundamentalism and this aggressiveness in discussion and the identity politics, that people tend really to distort their own views in the public arena. That's just an observation I wanted to add. That's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
I think both of those observations are very important. The idea that there's preference falsification for a variety of aspects. Eric Honecker and Timur's work, which in many ways framed his understanding of the revolutions of 1989. And his argument is that, for example, if you looked at Eric Honecker in August of 1989, he would have had approval ratings that were in the 80 to 90%. And then, within less than a few weeks, it reversed and flipped over. But I want to stress the other point that you raised, which besides preference falsification, which is cognitive dissonance. Well, let me finish the preference falsification. One of the implications also in Kuran's book is that the more we make the conversation unpleasant, the more we will hide our true views and therefore not have those true views contested, right? Because we'll retreat into the private when we try to make everything the public. This is a very Hannah Arendt point too, which means we can't actually advance. So yes, we can't predict revolutions, but we also can have honest and open discussions about very important issues, right? Because because what Kuran's whole point is that we are trading off our truthful self, our social reputation, right? So I'm an economist and I'm asked to judge whether or not I should have, sanctions against a certain regime. But if I say that sanctions are not very effective, then people think I support the regime. So therefore I don't say anything. And, and these kind of dilemmas. But the other question that I think you raised right from the beginning is cognitive dissonance. And I think this is just as important of an idea, which is why it is that intellectuals engage in all sorts of insulating stratagems to make sure that they don't have to update their beliefs. And I really like this podcast called Hidden Brain. It's an NPR podcast, and they had a whole show on the Seekers from 1954, which were these people that thought that the aliens were going to come and pick them back up. And they kept on having these meetings about when it is that they were going to be picked up by the lot. And you would think maybe these people were crazy. The head of the psychology department at Michigan State University was one of the major ones that was involved in this. And after continued repeated failure of the flying saucers to pick them up, one of the claims was in an interview to this guy who was a psychologist, and he said, it has to be true because I've given up everything in my life for this idea. And if it's not true, then I gave up everything, right? And so Shocker, I can't say the guy's name, but the guy who runs Hidden Brain, the parallel story that he used was a woman that was catfished. So she had gotten recently divorced, and this guy, you know, like got her on an online dating service or whatever, and they had fallen in love. She had never met him or anything like that. And she ended up by losing all kinds of money to him and all kinds of things like that. And her friends, her sisters, everyone tried to warn her about it, but she couldn't like have it not be true that this guy had fallen in love with her. And so what was all the insulating stratagems? So think about that in terms of science and discourse in general, the role that cognitive dissonance plays in, you know, sustaining false beliefs, right? And so I think that's a really important question that you raise. And how do you actually checkmate those things is to somehow constantly make it more and more difficult to have these kind of insulating stratagems, right? Where I constantly am repairing myself against the evidence and protecting myself from evidence of my false belief. So yeah. Yeah, okay. Scott.
Thanks, Pete. I have to say, I really enjoy talking or hearing you talk. I wish I was 30 years younger and could come study under you at George Mason. I really like the focus of the book being on dialogue, discourse, and debate. I'm good with that. I kind of thought there was a little bit too much filler and was a little too fluffy for my preferences. It also made me think of the quote by John Wooden, the excuse me, legendary basketball coach, where he says, "It's okay to disagree, but don't be disagreeable."
Yeah.
Kind of thing. I look at this topic and I always come back to where do you land on the spectrum of liberty? For me, there's a continuum. And it goes from at one end authoritarianism, and to the other end, what you were talking about, Pete, anarchy. So I kind of look at it as, you know, what's your basis for choosing where you land on that continuum? What are your first principles and your values, and where do they end up on that continuum? And, you know, I probably got twisted around with some of the discussion that you guys were contributing earlier, but it made me think of what essentially is truth. I mean, is that epistemology? And that's all I had.
Well, I think Adam Martin would be the best person to talk about this because he spent some time with the social ontology people at Cambridge, and he can talk about the difference between ontological claims and epistemological claims and relating to what you were just talking about. But, you know, look, I agree with you in the following sense that the book probably could have been half its size and made the point that it was trying to do. Probably all books can do that in a lot of ways. If you look at a book by Francis Fukuyama, it's like this huge book, and the chapter that really matters is the first chapter. And then after that, it's a lot of filler like that. But the real meat of the book is actually in the first chapter. I wouldn't say the meat of the book here is in the first chapter, but it's basically in the chapter on our politics, I think, and the impact of that on our discourse communities that we share. And there's just a sense of all of that going on. And there's more evidence of this divide and divisiveness in our country in our discourse. A lot of, rather than handshaking, there's a lot of finger pointing is another way to think about that. And I guess one of the questions you could ask is whether or not that's new or if that's, you know, something that's always been there. We're just now complaining about it more. But what is truth is a very interesting concept. I hate the phrase "my truth." I literally can't stand it. Okay. On the other hand, I recognize that there's different perspectives, right? So like different people from where they stand, they see the world differently than where other people stand. All right. And so think about a sporting event, right? And I'll tell you, so I mentioned the journalist stuff. I was an athlete in college. I moved from playing basketball to playing tennis in college. When I played tennis, I became obsessed with tennis. And it so happens that my favorite tennis player at the time was Bjorn Borg. I like I liked McEnroe, but I hated Jimmy Connors with a passion. But I kind of liked McEnroe, but I wanted Borg to win all the time. So I'm watching the famous, of course, 1980 match between Borg and McEnroe at my home. Loved it and everything like that. I go off to college. I'm sitting with everyone watching the Borg McEnroe U.S. Open final. And again, when it went down to the wire, McEnroe won this time rather than Borg. The newspapers, all right, if you look it up, they each actually got the same number of points. All right, that's how close the match was. Same points, okay, that they all got, okay, and the newspapers all talked about how McEnroe took care of Borg and all these things like that. And I remember thinking at the time, what match were they watching? Right? Like, what the hell match were they watching? Right? And it is because where you sit or where you stand is going to determine all this stuff. So how do I sort those things out? My truth versus the idea that there is a truth versus the idea that perspectivism. Right? And I want to recognize perspectivism, which is an epistemological point. And I want to sort of recognize that there is a truth, which is an ontological point. So I'm an ontological realist, but an epistemological contextualist. And I'll let Adam can explain why that's either confused or makes any kind of sense, or is it just me making up words, a word salad? But I think that that's a position I'm comfortable with in these regards. But it's a tough question. Sabine?
Thanks. So I actually enjoyed this book. It made me think a lot about civil discourse and had a lot of questions. The first line that struck me in the book was on page 77 when they say, when differences between factions is based on hatred rather than an honest disagreement, there's nothing to laugh at. Once I read that, I started thinking about a lot of things that I do. So I'm not a professor, but I sort of travel all around Canada giving talks to students, university students, about classical liberal ideas, where we bring people to come speak, professors to come speak on different topics, and sometimes we do it ourselves and all of that. And so I come in contact with a lot of students from a lot of different campuses, and a lot of the students show up to these talks to sort of fight with us or get or just like listen and just say, this is crazy, what are you talking about? It's completely fundamentally goes against everything I think of. And a lot of these students come in like wanting a fight. And of course, we have a lot of students who come and just want to genuinely listen or are interested in the ideas and just are very pleasant, more than the people who come out because they're sort of angry at the premise of the talk, that having not even heard it. That's rare, but it happens. And those people, usually when you sort of respond to them with respect and actually take their ideas into consideration when you're doing a talk that you're doing, they aren't angry anymore. The anger subsides pretty quickly, and they're kind of shocked that we actually want to engage with them and understand their viewpoint more, rather than just say, like, just roll our eyes at them and just be like, you guys don't know what you're talking about, which I think is what they usually get from a lot of their either professors who disagree with them or just people on the internet, perhaps. So having said that, like, that's the approach that that the professors we have take and we take as well. And that works really well. So I find that students just sort of want to make the world a better place. And that's really great. And we have to keep that in mind when we're talking to students, even when they have these ideas that we know aren't going to make the world a better place, or we believe will not make the world a better place. But that's the angle most of them are coming from. And I think that's really important. But having said that, I'm sort of left with two questions, having done the readings. the book and thinking about my own experiences and that I just shared with you. I'm wondering what we do about those people that they talk about, the asteroid people who just want, like, they're so angry and they have so much hatred against their opposing team that they're so far gone that maybe this sort of approach doesn't really work at this point. I don't think I got a very good answer from the book on that. I know there's things that we can do as liberals to do better in this, in talking to other people. I was reminded of Mike Munger when I was reading this book. He says over and over, like, we can't expect people to listen to us when we say things like, it's not capitalism, that's crony capitalism. When we say about socialists, like, socialists don't know what they're talking about. Socialists always say that, that's not real socialism. And in the same breath, we say things like, it's not real capitalism, that's crony capitalism. Like, things like that are important, that we realize we're doing them and then, like, change that and realize that we can learn from others about what's wrong with our own ideas and how to fix them. But I don't know if that's, like, I'm not sure how to address people that are so angry that they would rather see, like, a destruction of the opponent, and that's satisfying to them. And the other thing I didn't have a satisfactory answer to reading this book, and I'd love to hear from others about it, is whether or not, like, the internet has made this worse, making people go into these corners of fundamentalism that they may not have had access to before. And I say that with a grain of salt, because I know that usually the answer to these questions like this, in my opinion, is the past was the worst and horrible things happened, and everybody romanticizes it to the point where we think, like, oh, everybody got along before, and now the internet has ruined everything for everyone. And while in the past there were a lot of fundamental groups, there was a lot of fundamentalists, and they had a lot of followers, and the fact that they didn't have the internet to spread the things that they thought, and they still had so many people listen to them, is, like, super interesting to me. But is it true that because you can go more underground and you can really get, you can hear from other people who agree with you, and you can, that bubble that you live in, it can become sort of like metallic in a way that you can't get out of it anymore, because it's not even a bubble. You can't pop the bubble. It's just, you're just trapped inside of it because of the internet. I wonder if that's making it worse, or if it's just a new way of doing things. Sorry for the very long comment.
No, these are all really great ideas to discuss, and I hope maybe others can jump in on points that you're raising, because I think that let's just pick up your last one. So we have to recognize and not romanticize that it took a long time when the printing press was introduced for things not to be more disruptive, right? And so what did the printing press lead to? It led to a lot of disruption. Maybe in retrospect, we look back and we say, oh, that was good disruption. But at the time, it caused a lot of upheaval, in terms of tearing apart in religious wars, right? I mean, so no doubt the internet has allowed people to silo in a very effective way rather than to, engage or whatnot. But so I think we still have growing pains associated with how it is that we work with that, and it's relatively a new phenomena. The other thing that I would just raise a question to is, I think that in our communication, so you're a young woman, right? A lot of times people say things like classical liberals don't speak to women and minorities, right? But you're a young woman, you're a classical liberal, something in classical liberalism spoke to you. So the question is, what is it that spoke to you, and why wouldn't that be also an important message to share with others about it? Rather than the idea that we have to think about some new messaging, what we have to do is think about what it is that actually has been successful in the past, that convinced people or whatever or persuaded people of these ideas, and emphasize those. It might be just that some classical liberals emphasize the wrong things. Not that classical liberalism has a messaging problem. The messenger has a messaging problem rather than the ideas. And we just have to focus a little bit more on that. And this leads to my view with, that the best judge that all of us have as teachers, as whatever, is the mirror. So we have to look hard in the mirror and say, am I respecting the people that I'm trying to communicate with? am I doing the best that I can, or am I taking, shortcuts? So if I go and we have a lot of programs at Mercatus that require us to talk to a lot of students that don't share our priors. And the question is that, what is it that you communicate with them when you do that? And, but I'm gonna disagree slightly with my good friend, Mike Munger, in the following sense. The logical problems of socialism are not the same as the empirical problems of capitalism. Okay? And that we should not let people off the hook of those logical problems of socialism simply because they think they've invented a new modifier, democratic or whatever, right? Because the reality is that the history of socialist practice, they also thought they had the modifier, right? So it's not like Lenin said, let me be a bastard and squash people. He said, okay, what did he say? He said, we are going to combine Soviet democracy with German war planning. And that's going to give us the future socialist world. The British socialists said, I am a socialist in my economics because I'm a liberal Democrat in my politics. Okay? And so Bernie Sanders is nothing new. There's nothing new under the sun. AOC, nothing new under the sun. We saw her already. It's called Eva Peron, right? And so we've seen all of these manifestations before. Now, you can't go into an audience of a group of 18 and 20-year-olds and say stuff like that to them because that's not where they are. So this is why the mirror is important. You got to look in the mirror and recognize you got to respect the audience that you're talking to, begin where they are, and then work towards it. So maybe there might be a rhetorical aspect in which I can't just constantly say that, when you see, massive monopoly power in the US, you say, oh, that's crony capitalism, and then you see, the horrors of socialism. Oh, well, that's not real socialism or whatever. I just don't think you need to give up the full idea that socialism is an illogical system. It's not built to last. Right? Because the premises are not connected to the conclusions in which they're drawing. It's bad theorizing, bad policy, and all of that stuff. And so we need to communicate that. So, if we're going to have a conversation with them, we need to make sure they understand there's 100 million dead souls in the 20th century because of that social experiment. Let's not forget that, right? And we have a battle between, Mao and Stalin and Hitler on who's, a more, effective murderer of the population of which they govern. All right. So it's not because of war. It's not because of disease. It's because of a bullet in the back of the head to enforce the terror that's required in order to be able to enforce your system. So we need to communicate that to the young people so they understand. And it would be a huge mistake if we just let that off the hook, and so we have to look in the mirror and figure out a way to communicate that message with compassion and concern for the ends that they desire, a more just, as you put it, a better world, right? A more just and better world. But we can't let them off the hook just because we don't want to upset their sensibilities. That this dream aspiration is a horror, because it's the equivalent of telling people that they can flap their arms and fly to the moon and then leading them to a cliff and pushing them off and say, flap hard, and then watching them all die and say, well, at least they tried hard. They're good spirits, right? This is the kind of thing. And so we need to really be able to communicate that. Now, how we learn to do that, remember what I said, the messenger can be really bad, right? But the message appealed to you, it appealed to Sarah, it appealed to Alice, right? Right? So it's not like no one has ever communicated a classical liberal idea that appealed to women. No one's ever, communicated a classical liberal idea or the teachings of economics that didn't appeal to a minority, right? So what we need to do is find out what in those ideas actually, represented the opportunity society, represented the humanity of it all, and stress that. right? At the end of the day, this is what remember IHS's thing, the humane sciences, or the sciences humane, right? This is why I love this book, is because the humanities give us a capture of the complexity of human choice. The social sciences should actually be part of that as well. So anyway, Scott Brown.
Scott, you're muted. There you go.
First of all, I'd like to say that thank you, Pete. This has been great. The first one was awesome. I'd like to say I really agree with Philip. You can always tell what people are feeling threatened by what they react to. And I'll put Professor Boettke's idea about the messenger being a problem sometimes, is because there's very little in this book that I haven't heard many, many times before listening to the Rush Limbaugh program. But the main difference being that Rush never took himself so seriously as these authors, and he had 20 to 30 million listeners per week. But when it came to the book, I honestly was a little disappointed. You know, the authors had some stated opinions, like when they said that they believe in man-made climate change, and they had some unstated opinions, you know, which is, I thought, particularly what stood out to me and what I react to was I felt a particular bashing of all religions, but particularly Catholic and Christian religions. It felt like I was reading a very lazy discourse in leftist apologetics, which is funny because it seems like the authors kind of made religions for themselves of government, science, and their own intelligence. I kind of felt like, you know, if anyone wanted to read the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collectors, the authors kind of felt like the Pharisees to me. The one thing that I was going to, when I started my question, when I raised my hand, I was just going to disagree with Professor Boettke just a little bit on the nature of the social sciences, because I do believe that people are basically monolithic. And I think that given proper motivation, almost anyone will believe almost any lie or anything, because people are and I include myself in this, are not super smart. They'll believe a lie either because they believe it's true or because they're afraid it might be true. And because of that, you end up with half of America thinking that Republicans wanted to feed their grandparents, or that they wanted to push Granny over the cliff in a wheelchair. It's just I don't know. I guess it was more of a statement than a question, but it's I just figured I'd throw that out there just to see if there's any reaction at all.
I mean, I have to admit that the religion chapter is one that I skipped over really quickly because I was a little bit more focused on the politics and the economics questions. So maybe that was an error on my part. I do think that those kind of conversations for secular humanists are really difficult for secular humanists to have with people that are of faith and to understand it, because part of the whole secular humanist thing is to reject the issue of the faith. And so it's complicated. So yeah, I don't know if I have an answer to your direct question about their treatment of that. I do think, so, you know, they reference a book early on about Peter Berger called In Praise of Doubt. And the way they try to leverage what Berger is arguing in there. Berger also has a book called Redeeming Laughter. And I think a large part of a liberal discourse is the ability for us to laugh at ourselves, to not take ourselves too seriously. And to me, I think they don't take themselves too seriously, though I could see why people might think they do, because they're writing what their sense of humor is what might be called like, they're the difference between listening to NPR sense of humor versus, let's say, like you mentioned before, like Mark Levine or Russ Limbaugh or someone like that sort of sense of humor, right? both of them exhibit a kind of sense of humor. The more urbane sort of sense of humor is what they're trying to do in this book. And so it's in the ironies and whatnot. Another way to think about this, and this is not meant as an offense, please don't take it as an offense. And it may be a bad analogy, but it's the difference between listening to a George Carlin joke or a Gallagher joke, right? So Gallagher, used to smash the watermelons in front of you. He would do all those different things like that. Well, George Carlin was all like wordplay, right? It's all wordplay and internal things like that. And so I think there's both forms of that, not taking ourselves seriously and laughing at the human frailties and whatnot. That is the opposite of what a fundamentalist would hold to. And so I understand the point you're making, but I read very, very quickly through the religion checks, and so that's probably a mistake. Scott, I'm going to let Jake get in here because Jake hasn't had a chance to talk, and then I'll come back to you. So Jake?
Yeah, thank you. And I would just say, I did appreciate the book. I think following up from James Buchanan, I can see where you had these back to back. I appreciate a lighter read after Buchanan was pretty, I enjoyed Buchanan a lot, don't get me wrong, but it was pretty heavy. So I liked, and there's a lot of themes that work together. So I really appreciate these together. Talking through this today, I haven't put a lot of thought this beforehand, but made me think about the mission is to have more dialogue, have conversation. And my mind went to, I took a logic class in college years ago about logical fallacies, how we find ourselves into them. I took that class, I'm like, that's a logical fallacy. That's a lot, going around pointing them out. And it's well, I'm going to avoid these. I can't avoid them though. I would get a headache in an hour if I try to think about everything that deeply constantly. Of course my brain's going to take shortcuts. All of our brains are going to take shortcuts. I'm just curious, does it kind of tie in here? We just are drawn to that certainty. Our brains are wired in a way to find that comfort and to engage 100% all the time on thoughts. I think it's just maybe some human nature that we just kind of fall on those extremes. And that's the good reason to read a book like this, to try to pull us out of it. So that's just one comment. I wonder if you guys find that too, or I'm off base. And the other one, just wanted to jump in on that democratic socialist thing because I've had a lot of heart-to-heart with friends. And I think I'm coming from that as, I think I need to ask better questions to them in those moments. I think sometimes I fall into I want to explain, but my wife is from Venezuela, so I have someone who could talk about personal experience of the failure of socialism. But they don't mean that, right? No one means China, Mao and the gulags or Venezuela or Cuba. They mean Norway or Sweden or something like that. So they say not a modifier, but do they even mean socialism? They don't think they mean centrally controlled economies. So I think that's where just better questions can come in. They probably don't want the government making iPhones, right? So I think for me, my takeaway from those things are probably just asking better questions. But
yeah. I don't disagree with asking better questions. The point is that when Mao founded the Chinese Communist Party, Mao didn't actually argue that he was going to have the Cultural Revolution. Do you understand? Stalinism is a byproduct of the outcome of this system, not the aspiration. When you read Trotsky in Literature and Revolution, Trotsky's not arguing that we're going to end up by having Stalinism. All right, these are unintended byproducts of the system. So the reason why Hayek wrote The Road to Serfdom is because it's a unintended, undesirable consequence of adopting it here. In fact, it's viewed as a tragedy. And so, yes, they want Norway, how they understand Norway, not how Norway actually is, right? Or they want Sweden, how Sweden is, but it's not really what they is. They're not looking at Sweden. They're looking at a rhetoric about Sweden, which is not the reality of Sweden. And so one way to talk to these people is to look and say, what do you think the economic freedom score is of these countries? Oh, they're actually higher on economic freedom, let's say in 2016 than the US. How about that? And how about if we look at actual data on welfare spending? right? It's an NBER paper comparing Nordic spending on welfare and the US spending on welfare. And so you say, what do you think about US versus Nordic countries on welfare spending? Oh, the Nordic countries spend all the money on welfare, the US nothing. We've gutted our budget. And then you show them the actual numbers. And you're like, here, take a look, right? How are they going to process this? It goes back to Philip's point about cognitive dissonance. They would resist that number. They would try to find all kinds of ways to show that the US doesn't have an extensive welfare state. And somehow, like if you're on a gurney having a heart attack, but you don't have a credit card, we dump you off into the road and like you just croak in the road or whatever, right? Because that's their vision about the world. So I think that we have a lot of work to do. I agree with you, by the way, that we can't say it the way I've just been saying it. Because, right, so I understand that we have to ask better questions. We have to, do these things, but we shouldn't forget that no one says, I want to be in control so I can kill millions of people, right? I want to be in control because I want to bring the world, right? Remember what the Marxist dream was. I'm going to move from the kingdom of necessity to the kingdom of freedom. And what am I going to achieve? Through the rationalization of production, I'm going to actually produce harmony among all the peoples in the society. All class conflict will disappear, right? So it's not that they said, like, we're going to create a new class and they're going to squash and put in the gulag all the people that disagree with us, right? That's not the goal. And so I think that we, teaching people that intentions are not the same as outcomes is vital to this conversation. Anyway, we got 10 minutes left and I have 4 people. So I'm going to just let those people talk and then I will be quiet. So go as follows in order: Sarah, Scott, Sabine, and Alice.
Super quickly, Pete, I think that the point that Mike and Sabine were making is not so much one about a difference in fact as it's a problem of rhetoric, right? I think the argument is that if we say that's not capitalism, that's crony capitalism, it sounds as if we are making the same argument that we criticize socialists for making. Whether or not it is the same argument is sort of beyond the point, because they will stop listening once it sounds as if we are making the same argument that we criticize them for making. So we need to stop saying it that way if we want people to listen. That's all.
Well, I'm going to violate my own rule here, as I always do.
I knew I could make you talk.
I agree with that. That's why I said the messenger matters, to the message. But I also think that we can't let arguments off the hook, right? If people are running around saying 2 + 2 = 5, we can't say, well, in some perspectives, it seems like it's 2 + 2 = 5, and so sometimes rhetoric matters in the sense of coming down hard on a bad idea too, right? And so I don't know the right balance. I'm not smart enough to know the right balance of when it is that you bring the hammers of logic down on top of people's head, and when is it that you just have like soft little conversations on the margins with people. I don't know what the right thing is at the right time. I will tell you that I, as a student, found it extremely valuable to have hammers come down. When I was a 19-year-old and listening to economics for the first time and learning about it, it was like, holy shit, this explains everything that is wrong with the world. Right? And it came down, it was like, boom, like that. And I was like, I want to sign up for that puppy because I just squashed the bugs that have been bugging me in my brain for a long time. And sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't, because sometimes, the bugs in your brain, you don't want to give up. You're like, no, I love it all or whatever. So I don't know when the right time is or when it is, and I think it's best to probably have a multiplicity of voices, so that people can find out who's good for which audience. So anyway, I apologize, Scott. Go ahead.
I meant to add this to the mess that I contributed earlier. I think I have a bug in my brain. I was trying to reconcile your earlier comments about laissez-faire, and then you're in your bones and in your soul being an anarchist. And before you go to that, if you can, to me, like the core issues come down to individualism versus collectivism. and freedom versus coercion. I mean, ultimately, to me, that's what it is. And I hope this isn't too personal of a question, but there's the Mercatus Center at George Mason, and there's the Rothbard Institute at Auburn. Like, how do you view them, and how do they view you? That's it.
I'm not going to answer that right now until I get everyone else in, but go ahead, Sabine.
Sorry about that. I just wanted to say that, Pete, I think it's really, you put it really well when you said like the messenger can be bad rather than the message, and you have to meet them where they're at. That helps. And I wanted to quickly answer your question why I'm a classical liberal. I'm a woman and I'm an ethnic minority. My parents immigrated to Canada from Lebanon, and I found classical liberalism to be the closest thing to something that's important to me. And that's why I talk about it and I'm in this line of work, because I want to fundamentally be left alone as a woman and as an ethnic minority to practice the religion I choose, to take on a lifestyle I wish, to practice whatever ethnic practices I feel like, as long as I'm not hurting anybody. I also think war is terrible. My parents immigrated from Lebanon, as I said, so I know from their stories that war is terrible and we should really avoid doing it. And tolerance is great. And I think that all intersects with me as a woman and as a minority. And framing classical liberalism, classical liberal ideas as something that intersects with a desire for things like environmentalism, like feminism, like pacifism, and showing why socialism doesn't intersect well with those things and actually makes these things worse and harmful. If we keep doing that, maybe that's the answer to my initial question, now that I heard what you had to say about that. So I'll have to think more about that. But I think that might just like keep going at it. Like, this is another way to think about it. This is another way to environmentalism. This is another way to these things that matter to you, that students, that young people think help save the world or make the world a better place. Like, we have, I mean, there's this answer too. What about this one? So I think maybe if you keep hammering it home and squash those bugs, I think that's one way to answer my question. So thank you.
By the way, the bugs I meant were the bugs in our own brain, not the bugs out there outside. Yeah. Go ahead, Alice.
Oh, yeah. I'm thinking that on this auspicious day of 02/22/22, right? The ideology that we're watching happen in the world today of a repeat of what was the 20th century ill-fated thinking.
Yeah.
This is just really kind of extraordinary. It makes me think, and I've said this so often over the decades of teaching, there can't be a more important time to talk to young people, to teach young people the ideas of economics, and to watch that hammer happen to the head. And I say that, you know, what I have the wonderful opportunity to teach students for 2 years in an IB program, so I don't have to hammer. I get to have them come to conclusions and to constantly have to answer my question, at what cost? And to think about the ideas of how, you know, markets don't fail. The spontaneous order of supply and demand is going to give us an equilibrium, which we may not like the outcome of, and then we can look at interventions. It's so necessary that young people are introduced to economic thinking. And reading this book just further reminds me of whatever attempts we're doing. I know that it is that one-on-one relationship, that it is not just the independent reading that students do, that classrooms, the opportunity to talk. And Pete, real quickly to what you brought up earlier, my concern in the classroom is that, yes, we do have those loud voices that drown out others in the room, the same 3 or 4 persons, and increasingly that very silent group too, both of which are so deeply concerning in a classroom. And I mentioned really quickly last week when Sarah was talking with you, that I'm getting students to post on discussions before publishing it, asking all of them to respond to a question or to a circumstance, so that those that don't listen are forced to have to read others, and those that won't necessarily want to talk are, well, sort of encouraged strongly to have to put their words out there too, and that we just never, ever stop trying.
Yeah.
That's all.
Michael, that's excellent. I love that message. Yeah, Michael.
So just on the not real socialism versus capitalism, one thing I liked that helped frame my thinking was Michael Novak refers to what he calls definitional imperialism, which he says if a socialist defines socialism as the system which nationalizes property like in order to help the poor, and then they define capitalism as like the system of private property that like intends to benefit the rich. He says, well, you just baked in both the rules and the consequences into one definition. So then when it fails to achieve the outcome you wanted, you say it didn't meet the definition, so it wasn't real socialism. He says, no, you can't do that. You can either define the rule and say, nationalism of property, now let's test what the consequence is. Maybe it helps the poor, maybe it doesn't, let's find out. Or you define the outcome, say we want to help the poor, now let's go test which rules lead to that. But it's one or the other. And Jason Brennan in Why Not Capitalism discusses the same thing, except he calls it the Cohen fallacy after G.A. Cohen. So I suppose the way I frame it is if someone says it wasn't real socialism because it didn't yield the outcome they wanted, I say, well, you're committing that. On the other hand, so I guess ask them why was it not real socialism? Did it not meet the definition of the rules of the game that you were talking about, or did it not meet the outcome you were talking about? Depending on which one they answer, now we can take it further.
Yeah. I think that I'm going to wrap up here. So Shelley, just give me 2 minutes. I think the beauty of economics, and I do think it's beautiful. It's one of the things. I mean, Sarah, when we had our conversation, was talking about how she learned economics. Sarah ended up by marrying my best friend from graduate school. And the one thing that united Steve and I was that we fell in love with the beauty of economic reasoning. There's like a beauty of economics that a lot of people don't get until you can communicate it effectively. But there's something beautiful about economics and the reasoning. And part of it is this means ends reasoning, that you don't collapse explanations to just simply good people do good things, bad people do bad things, but you actually follow through the logic of the relationship of means to ends. And so part of my issue of recoiling with the issue about the socialism debate and the capitalism debate is that we forget it's about means and ends, right? So exactly what you just said, Michael. So I thought that was great. And I think that, Sabine, your answer is the best answer. Liberalism is liberal. This is the opportunity. It gives us the widest scope for ordinary people to do extraordinary things. And we need people to give us that space. And we're trying to create that space for us. And that's the right way to do it. And the messenger matters. So hearing a woman in an ethnic minority talk about the opportunity economy is different from listening to, a white male, imbued with all kinds of privilege talking about opportunity economy, right? And so the messenger matters a lot, but the message is one of an opportunity economy, an opportunity society, a liberal society, a cosmopolitan liberal society. And I think that's anything that's peaceful is a major message there. And I would just say, Scott, that the issue shouldn't be about the different manifestation of institutions in different universities. It should be, what do those ideas represent? What are the people that are communicating those ideas? And so I happen to be like thoroughgoing a liberal. I'm for open borders. I'm for free mobility of labor and capital. I, want to get the state out of everything. And so I want to, depoliticize our society. And when we think about that, those are the kind of positions that I'm trying to move towards, to see the beauty of the sort of voluntary actions and voluntarism sort of emerge up, and how it is that we cooperate so that we can live and be free and responsible individuals who can participate in a market economy and live in caring communities, right? And so that's the kind of society I want to see us have. And so I would judge not whether or not it came from Auburn or from GMU or from NYU or wherever. I would judge whether or not the ideas were communicating those ideas. And so if ideas are coming from there that are stressing those things, I'd be like, hey, go for it. But if ideas are fighting against it, and saying, no, we can't do that or whatever, I'd be like, why? Like, just, and what's the justification for your reason for why you think we should violate from the voluntary principle? And so I don't think anyone has a monopoly privilege on having the right view on any of these issues. So anyway, you should have received or will be receiving the next book, which is it's actually Sabine's motto. Leave me alone and I'll make you rich, which is a fascinating thing. Maybe we should just stop by the first thing, leave me alone, which is the first thing. And it's by McCloskey and Art Carden. And I'm going to work to try to, many of you can see videos, and I'll post some videos of McCloskey talking about her work, but I'm going to try to have a conversation with Art Carden, in coming up about the book. And I will, send out some stuff probably, by Monday to, give you some like videos and some questions or whatever, and see the link here. But this goes back to my roots in economics and the entrepreneurial society. And again, if you, in more recent times, you have the Matt Ridley book, which is on how innovation works. And he has a great phrase. He says, innovation is the child of freedom and the parent of prosperity. I want you to think about that as you read through this book. And then an older book by Thomas Sowell called Knowledge and Decisions. And the last paragraph of Sowell's book, Knowledge and Decisions, which I recommend everyone pick off their shelf if they have it and read, because it's about the elbow room that ordinary people can have. And I think this is going back to our political divisions in this book. I think one of the clash of visions, to use another phrase from Sowell, is that right now we're kind of in a weird world where we have a very strong belief system from the progressive elites that argue that what we need to have is extraordinary people who we selected out, right, from going to the right schools and everything. Right? So extraordinary people can do extraordinary things if we just give them the power to achieve it, versus the kind of position that Sowell is laying out, which is that ordinary people can do extraordinary things if just given the freedom. And so do we trust the elites to rule over us in the right way, or do we trust the people to actually give us these amazing things that are possible? And so who do we find our trust following in that kind of debate? Well, this argument is coming down on leave me alone, and the ordinary people will do extraordinary things like give you cell phones, give you pharmaceuticals, give everything like that. So again, I mentioned Mises at the beginning here. Read the last paragraph of Sowell's book, Knowledge and Decisions, and the last paragraph of Mises, Human Action, when he sums it all up and he states what the power of economics does for freedom and prosperity. And I think it's brilliant. But anyway, I love having these conversations with all of you. I hope you're enjoying them. And we'll be on to our next book, right? Deirdre McCloskey. So Amy or Shelley, if you have something to say.
Just very briefly, Pete, thank you very, very much. This has been a great conversation. I appreciate it. We're a little bit over time. I apologize for that. Given my technical difficulties, you see that Pete could